So let's talk now a bit more about these objects that I introduced. The result value object. As I said, it's a coarse-grained representation of data. And we saw in Python, we had lists and we had dictionaries, which are like a map. And you could end up with them all over the place. There's no real control on it. So the whole idea about the result value object is you group the items together. So you have in one object all the data you're going to need. It's going to be the way that you pass data from your model through to the controller and back to the view. It's going to be a standard application interface, the way that you're going to transmit data from one component to another. That was why it was so easy for me to produce the XML from the result value object, because rather than investing code in an object that knows how to handle employees, I've invested a code in a component that knows how to handle all tables. All it has to do is receive instructions and it will do the work. So it's a different approach. So, as I said, it can contain data from any table, and it isn't expected to be just the data from one table. It will be a single, gets cut out a bit here, but a single logical unit of work. So if this was a JSP, and a web application, it would be all the data that I'm going to display in my web page. If it's XML, then it's all the data I need to produce my document. So hopefully I'll be able to show you an example of that. Let's go in the beginning. We'll change the department. I'll choose the IT department. And you can see I'm there along with code jockey and pattern designer. And I could change my salary. Far too much. Bring it down like that. I could change my date of birth, make myself a bit younger, I guess. That's what was I born in? Okay. And I update, and you can see that this, my components are handling the data and doing all these changes for me. So we're not only able to read data, but we're also inserting and updating data. That's something I've talked about now because I want to come back to it later. You notice that we have string fields, the employee name, the sex, and the comments, but we also have numeric fields, the salary, and we have date fields. And please remember that, because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And we've managed to handle that fine with our components. But coming back now to our result value object, this is our result value object. We have one vector which has got an overview of all the employees. We have another vector for a form of data. Why do we do it as a vector? Because we may have more than one row. But each individual field is, each individual row is a map inside that vector. We also have general data, which has a one-on-one relationship with the screen. So we're showing here the department name and the manager and stuff like that. So that's what, oops, so that's what what is contained in our result value object. And it also contains instructions on how to display the data, so the headings and the XML tags. And as I said earlier, it's a standard application interface, so that it makes it very easy to write our view if we know that we're expecting the data, always to receive the data in a particular object. Likewise, the model. All models return the same object. And in fact, we can then make the whole process so simple that we could have a default model and a default view. And they would always work because they know how to handle this result value object. So let's have a look at that. No, right page. I go back one page, and I have here employees, but not using a model. And you can see it shows me all of the employees in all of the departments. And then I can change it to show and department ID is 1, and it's now restricted itself to one department. I didn't have to write the JSP, I didn't have to write the model. The components know how to work with this standard application interface. So what does the DB utility do? Much the same as what Spring is doing for us with JDBC. It handles all the SQL activities, contains rows to run SQL, and I can return multi-rows, single rows, perform inserts, updates, deletes, you name it, whatever you have to do. The DB utility will do that. And it also allows our variables to be bound to database items, either by name or by position matching. So if we look at the example here, insertion into the employees table, we've got 3 items: employee number, employee name, and employee salary. And when we want to do an insert, we've just got to make sure that our map, trans, has got those 3 items. It's got the employee number with the value, it's got the employee name with its value, and employee salary with its value. If we're doing something like this, select from employees where employee number is particular value, then we could be doing position matching. So get multi-row for this particular SQL using this array list. So it's a very simple way of working. And the code looks a little bit different from what we're used to in a standard Java environment. There's no get employee name, get employee salary. Instead, when we iterate through our vector, and we get a map for each row, we're saying map get employee name or get employee salary. I deliberately didn't use Java 5 so that we have to show the casting. I want you to make a point. And when we bind values to our prepared statements, it's much the same sort of thing. We have a method which picks out the placeholders in our SQL and returns those as an array of items. And then when we're going to set the values to our prepared statements, we're going to iterate through those items and we're going to set the value. And I'm doing something naughty here, very, very naughty. I hope everybody's going to object that when I set the values for my prepared statement, I said set string. That's breaking the rules. You're not supposed to do that. Well, actually, if you're pragmatic and you test around a bit, you'll see that set string actually works for numeric fields and for date fields, as well as for string fields. Obviously, it doesn't work for blobs or things like that, but your normal primitive data types in your database, set string will work. It works with Oracle, it works with Sybase, it works with SQL Server, even works with MySQL. And so all this data type conversion that we do standard in the Java world isn't always necessary. I said isn't always necessary. Number fields are quite easy to do. Date fields are a little bit more complicated. You have to correctly format your date. The database will normally accept the data as a string, providing it's in a particular format. So you're going to have a utility class out there which would convert the data to the right format for your database. That's it. And hopefully you won't have to use that very often. But also, a map, by definition, contains data of different types. So if we wanted to say set float, we could first examine the contents of our map and see if that entry is of an instance of type float, in which case we say set float rather than set string. So if people don't feel comfortable with the code I've used here, it isn't necessary. Before I go into that, I'll just show you the source code for the web page I was just playing around with. It's, I think I've lost it. Oh, well. It's, the first thing you notice is there's not very much Java code there. It's all SQL. And when I was coming here, there was a sign for Adobe, and Adobe, of course, is talking all about Flex and so on, but they also talk about Cold Fusion. Does anybody know Cold Fusion? One person putting their hand up. That's how you would code in Cold Fusion. It's very SQL-centric. And it's a very nice way of working, providing, of course, you're familiar, you feel happy with SQL. And so what we've done is, when we wanted to show our list of employees, this was the SQL for it. Give me all the employees for a particular department. When I wanted to show the data for a particular employee, retrieve any information for employees where the employee number is that particular parameter value. When I want to show my extra data, it's getting the information from two tables joined together, the department and the employees. When I want to update data, what I do is that I make sure that the parameters I receive from my JSP page match the names of my items in the database. And so I automatically get into my map the items with the correct name. But if for some reason I haven't got them in the correct name, no problem. We just set them like this. Department ID is my variable department ID. And if I have to change the birth date, then I do my data conversion to format it into the correct format. Unfortunately, this slide gets cut out a bit. My apologies for that. I didn't have much time to get everything ready. But who feels comfortable using stored procedures and database functions? A reasonable number of people. I would argue that that should always be part of our toolbox as a Java developer, or any developer. Because some problems can be far easier solved in SQL than they can in any language. Particularly when we want to get data from a number of tables, and we don't want to be continuously going back and forth to our database to get this data. That was one of the things that killed the client-server. Client-server applications were not scalable because the applications were written in such a way they were continuously going back and forth to the database. That was fine, one user. But as soon as you get above a certain number of users, the scalability just disappeared. It ground to a halt. Now in the Java world, we have lots of little tricks that we use to solve these problems. We go back and forth to the database, not that much, and we keep a lot in memory and so on. So basically what we're trying to do is do the same thing as what Oracle has been doing for the last 10 or 15 years. They've been optimizing the handling of data. And they've had 15 years to perfect their art. And we're saying, oh, we can come in a couple of weeks and do something better. Well, maybe we can, but I'm not as good as that. I'd like to just use what Oracle's doing. So here's an example. I'm going to produce a report of all the documents which are available to me, and I've got the document ID and the document name, and I want to know which ones are accessible for me, because I've got some very secure data here, and I don't want any of these documents to fall in the wrong hands. And to establish whether I have access, you would first to see if the user belongs to a group, and this user and that group has access to the document. So you can just imagine there's a couple of select statements just to do that. If that's true, we return 1. So we've got we do have access. If it's not true, we ask if the actual, if the user has access to that document. And if that's true, we return 1. That's a very simple thing. I'm sure if you have security is a big issue for your systems, your security algorithm is quite a bit more complicated than that. Now, you can write it as a Java class. Works fine. But you try and use that Java class when you're retrieving 50 or 60 rows of data. Or maybe you want to show the data as a tree view. So you actually, you might be reading the whole database to show the possible, all the folders you've got. And you would find that your Java code is quickly grind into a halt. Whereas if we put this code in a function, this is the Oracle syntax. One reason why people don't like putting too much in a database is the syntax is different for different databases. I'll grant you that. But normally, to convert from one database to another is not that much work. But, so we have a function here, is accessible for this particular document ID and the username. And the nice thing about when we work like that is that the SQL is retrieving the value of this is accessible function as part of the data. So to get the data and the accessibility is one single trip to the database. Not going back and forth to get extra data. In one go, you get all the information that you need. And so I would argue that a pragmatic Java developer would definitely make use of these stored procedures. The XML utility, I think it's fairly straightforward. I don't really want to talk much about it. It handles all of your XML activities. It creates the XML from collection objects. That's its job. It receives the tag information, possibly from the result value object. That was a simple example I showed you. Thank you. And but I actually have a more complicated object which I could be passing to it, to the XML utility, which would be an XML vector. And that would be an XML representation of my data. So it would have all the instructions I need to create XML from that data. So I want to know, is that particular item treated as an element, or is it treated as an attribute? And if it's is there extra attribute information for that element, yeah. So I had to be very selective in what I talked about here. I hope that the examples I've shown you, if you were interested and relevant, most important thing. But I think if we take the sort of approach that I'm talking about here, then the answer to the question, can Java compete with Python, PHP, and Rails? I would say it can not only compete, but it does it much better. It's a different way of working. It's a much more direct working, much more rough working. It's not the same smooth interface that we're used to in Java, but it's quick, It works and it's pragmatic. And one reason why I'm really glad that that works is that Java is very rich in features, and a lot of the features we take for granted in the Java environment are just simply not present in these other languages. They're not mature enough yet. And so, although some of them have been around almost as long as Java. So the conclusion is that if we want to compete against PHP or Rails or Python, your boss says to you, next project is going to be done using one of these technologies, you can say, no, wait a minute. We can do just as well in the Java world. Give me a couple of weeks and I'll show you. So the lady there with the timer would be happy. It's the end now. Ask questions. You can either ask questions now, or you can catch me during the course of the day. Or you can just email me. There's my email address. That's it. The one thing I should say is I'm rather hard of hearing. So if you've got any questions, please say it to my colleagues here. Can you stand up, please? And they'll then relay the question to me. Or you can catch me later. That's it. Thank you. It was the end of the time anyway, I think. But that doesn't mean you can't ask questions. You can always catch me all day. Oh, somebody's got... Yeah, sure.
It's more of an objection. If I come to your... if I would work in your environment, you would leave and I would follow you up. Your first program you did with Spring, I know Spring, so I can work immediately from day one. The second, your custom component, I don't know. I have to work into that. I have to read into that.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Can I handle that with you separately? Because I read lips as well, and I can't see you.
No problem.
But, can you come up here?
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, sure. Oh, okay. Any other questions? It's much easier one-on-one, actually, because I'm terribly deaf. It comes with being older. But thank you for your time.